again. This is Don Stevens, and tonight we're going to cover chapter 16 of the book of Judges. So without any ado, here we go. Then Samson went to Gaza, one of the Philistine cities. He saw there a harlot. He went in unto her, and it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither. And so they encircled him in, and they laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it's day, we're going to kill him. And Samson was there until midnight. And he arose at midnight, came to the gates, found them locked and barred. So he took the doors of the gate of the city, the two posts, and he went away with them, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. Now Hebron is about 11 miles away from this area of Gaza. So this guy actually carried this gate, the post, and the bars of the entrance to the city up to the top of the hill where you could get a view of Hebron. He dumped the gates up there. It came to pass afterwards that he loved a woman who was in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords and the Philistines came up to her and said unto her, entice him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we might bind him and afflict him, and we will give you, every one of us, 1,100 pieces of silver. Now this hatred of Samson and the desire to do away with him by the Philistines had been in place for many, many years at this time. I mean, in fact, Samson had been the judge of Israel for some 20 years. And these guys at this point, at the end of the 20 years, are still seeking satisfaction against him. I mean, there's really no doubt that as many such confrontations had occurred over this reign of 20 years. But this story is the one for which everyone remembers Samson. Now we know that there were 5 lords of the Philistines. So the total sum Delilah is promised here is really 5,500 pieces of silver, if she can find out the secret of his strength and how he might be bound. So Delilah said to Samson, tell me, I pray thee, wherein your great strength lies, how you might be bound to be afflicted. Samson said unto her, if they would bind me with 7 green whips that were never dried. Now the whip was actually a bowstring. They used these vines for bowstrings. They'd dry them before they used them for the bowstrings. He said if they would tie him with these green bowstrings that had not been dried, then he would be weak like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought to her 7 green whips, which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And there were certain men lying in wait who were abiding in the chamber. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he broke the whips as a thread of tow is broken when it touches a fire. And so his strength was not known. Delilah said unto him, Samson, you've mocked me, haven't you? You've told me lies. Tell me, I pray thee, where might you be bound? And he said unto her, if they bind me fast with new ropes that were never used, then I shall be weak as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him with them, and said unto him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And there were men lying in wait, abiding in the chamber, and he broke them from off of his arms like a thread. And Delilah said unto Samson, you've mocked me and told me lies. Tell me wherewith you might be bound. And he said unto her, if you would weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and the loom. And so she fastened it with a pin, that is, the shuttle. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awakened out of his sleep and went away with the pin of the beam and with the web. Basically, he carried away the entire loom. And she said unto him, how can you say you love me when your heart is not really with me? You've mocked me these 3 times. You have not told me wherein your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words and urged him, so that his soul was vexed nearly to death, he told her all of his heart. He said unto her, there is not come a razor upon my head, For I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will go from me. I will be weak like other men. Wow, this is one of the most captivating stories in the Bible. And I really struggle understanding Samson here. His actions are almost disgusting. I mean, he has lost his senses, has absolutely no good judgment in this event. You would think that he'd be able to figure out that Delilah is not the girl for him. I mean, he'd be able to figure out that she has evil intent for him every single time. And every time he tells her something, he goes to sleep and he's always awakened by Delilah shouting that the Philistines are upon him. I mean, unless he is so captivated by her that he actually believes that she's warning him of the impending danger, basically with the purpose of being to try to save his life, his lack of action just makes no sense. Anyone with even an iota of sense would, at least after the second event, figure out that this woman is out to get him. I mean, logic would tell you that the Philistines had to have someone informing them of all of these things that he was telling her. I mean, not only where he was, but that he was bound, etc., etc. I mean, certainly he had to understand that this woman was trying to destroy him. And it seems that any man with any sense of judgment at all would realize that this is not the place for him. And this is absolutely not the woman for him. It really never ceases to amaze me how a man can get caught up with the passions and the lust of the flesh and immediately loses all sense of value. I mean, some young, pretty little thing, down at the office can turn the guy's head and he loses sight of the value of his own family, his home, a loving wife in most cases, the glory of having a bunch of really great kids. I mean, the joy and the love you get from your children is amazing, and to lose track of that just makes no sense. And they all get pushed aside while he gets carried away by his own personal passions. I mean, thoughts about how he never really loved his wife. His marriage was a mistake. He shouldn't have been married to her in the first place. He deserves to be treated better than what she treats him. They have nothing in common. I mean, those kind of things seep into the guy's mind, and he loses all sense. Quickly forgets those little things which are so important to happiness, like the hugs and kisses of your kids. I mean, soon this guy, Samson in this case, is spending time with this Delilah, making lame excuses to his wife and family, and he's lost all sense of value. His judgment escapes him, and he gets carried away and caught up in this lustful fantasy world. Man's flesh has a tremendous power, so much so that it can actually distort a guy's whole value system. And this is certainly the case with Samson. His sense of judgment was completely gone. He couldn't see what was so very obvious to anyone that reads the story. I mean, in addition to that, what's up with all this flirting and playing games with this woman? I mean, Samson is, to say the least, compromising playing these games. Many times Christians have a personal spiritual experience where God moves closer to them. And with the presence of God, we're able to see our lives so much clearer, and we're able to make good judgments and evaluations of things. We realize those things that we need to clean out of our lives, including some friends and locations that are not really good for us. And this is all in our new spiritual walk with the Lord. When you're away from all the pressures and God is with you, helping you see things with a clearer perspective, you can make decisions on how you're going to better serve the Lord in the first place. I mean, maybe you've been to a retreat yourself and you rededicate yourself and make a determination that you're going to serve the Lord better than you ever have before. But then you come back home and the phone rings and some of your friends are on the other end, and these friends are friends that you know are probably not good for you, but they want you to go to a party where you know you shouldn't be. And you make up a lame excuse like, thanks for calling, but I have a terrible headache tonight. Maybe next time. And you think you're being nice, but you're just playing games. I mean, you're leaving the door open for future invitations and with those future temptations. I mean, bind me with a few ropes or green bowstrings. You see how that works? I mean, when you get a call like that, you need to speak the truth. I mean, believe me, the truth is the quickest way to get rid of that temptation. I mean, if you tell the person on the other end of the line, the one that's tempting you with a party, that you've rededicated your life to Christ, they won't call you back. I mean, trust me on this one. Doing this will close the door for any future invitations. The danger of leaving the door open is that the next time they call, it'll be most likely at a weak moment in your life when Satan's really been hassling you, harassing you. Satan will catch you in the snare. In Psalms we read, by a whorish woman a man is brought to a crust of bread. I mean, here Samson poured out his heart. I've been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, my strength will go. I'll be weak. And Delilah was a very perceptive person. When she saw that he had told her all that was in his heart, she called for the lords of the Philistines. She said, come up, for he has shown me all of his heart. They came to her with money in hand, and she plotted against Samson to make him sleep on her knees, during which time she had a guy shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to push him around, and his strength was gone. And when she announced, the Philistines are upon thee, Samson, he awoke out of his sleep, and he figured he would be fine. His strength would still be with him. So you see, Samson didn't know that the Lord had departed from him. He was not aware. It is possible for a person to play around with God and sin until they get to the place where the Spirit of God departs from them. They live in a deception, thinking they can quit the sin at any time because they still have the strength of the Lord. But that strength has left them. They can no longer beat off the Philistines. There's no strength left. There's no reserve tank. The Philistines took Samson and put out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with fetters of brass. In Scripture, brass is a metal that signifies judgment. Samson suffered judgment in the prison. They gave him the most menial of all tasks, the task that was given to the lowest slave. His duty was that of pushing the big posts around in a circle where the millstone would roll around, grinding the grain into flour. Now, this is a perfect picture of what sin does to a man. First of all, it blinds a person from the truth. Paul said, the God of this world has blinded their eyes that they cannot see the truth. A person that is being caught up in sin is blind to the true condition. He thinks everything is okay, that he has it all under control, but he doesn't. He's blind to the reality of what Satan is doing. His life is being destroyed, but he can't see it. When you know someone who is in this situation, it may be obvious to you that the level of proficiency is going downhill, but they don't see it. They can't. They're blind to the facts. They're blind to the truth. But one day they wake up and they find that they're bound. It becomes a realization that they can't quit. It's got a hold on them. They begin to panic because they try to stop, but the withdrawals hit them. And they think about how they never intended it to go this far. Once it gets to this point, it becomes a grind. It no longer gives them pleasure or excitement, and they just move into a state of miserable loneliness. Sin grinds away at their lives. Howbeit the hair on his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Don't make the mistake of thinking that Samson's strength lay in his long hair. His strength, his true strength, lay in his commitment to God, of which the long hair was a sign. You know, folks sometimes read this story shallowly, and they make the mistake of believing the strength was in his hair. But it wasn't. It was in his commitment to God. The Nazarite vow was a vow of commitment to God. That was the secret of his strength. When his hair was shaved, it was a sign of a broken vow. a broken covenant with God, a broken commitment. A man who breaks his covenant with God becomes weak, like any other man. You become a victim of the enemy's powers. But again, we see God's grace is so great, and the hair on his head began to grow again after he was shaven. The lords of the Philistines had gathered together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon. Now, Dagon was a fish god. In his representations, he looked a bit like a mermaid, only he had a male face. So Dagon was represented by a male face and upper torso with the tail of a fish. Now, before you laugh too much at the fact that these Philistines worshipped a fish, half man, half fish, think about the theory of evolution for a minute. Now, this theory has filled our education system. It's now talked about as fact, not as theory, although it is a theory of evolution. Isn't evolution somewhat the same thing? I mean, man crawled out of the water onto dry land. It's worth some thought, because many folks today are still worshiping Dagon, at least in my mind. Now, he was the god of the Philistines, so they were going to worship Dagon and rejoice, giving Dagon credit for delivering Samson into their hands. And when the people saw Samson in this pitiful state, they praised their God. You know, when David was committing his sin with Bathsheba, we're told in 2 Samuel verses 13 through 15, so David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die. Then Nathan departed to his house. Now that's always one of the sad byproducts of the Christian falling. The enemies of God are always saying things like, aha, and they're supposed to be Christians. But look at what they've done now. Our failures as Christians may cause the enemies of God to blaspheme. Here, Samson caused the enemies of God to celebrate in blasphemy by causing them to praise their god Dagon. Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. So it came to pass when their hearts were merry that someone said, hey, let's call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And so they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport. And they set him between the pillars, and Samson said unto the lad that held him by the hand, allow me to fill the pillars whereupon the house stands, that I might lean on them. Now it could be that he was dancing for them and making sport, or it could be that it was just the fact that he was there, his presence alone, that was the cause of a lot of jeers, a lot of heckling, a lot of laughter, a lot of scorn, and a lot of screaming and excitement. Perhaps they were pushing him around, tripping him, perhaps even watching him stumble and watching him try to find his way around with no eyes and in a strange place. Perhaps it was just the sight of this man who had been such a terror to them in that pitiful, weakened condition, which was such great sport for them, resulting in the laughing and the jeering. So Samson said to the little boy, lead me to the two pillars that hold this place up. The house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. There were about 3,000 of the men and women there in the arena. And they were watching as Samson made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee. Only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes, God. Samson called out to God to once more let him feel God's power, so that he could get even with the Philistines for the loss of his eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and upon which it was held up, one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson prayed, let me die with the Philistines. And he bound himself with all of his might, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people that were there. So that the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. And his brothers, those of the house of his father, came down, and they took his body and brought him and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel for 20 years. Now this was a sad and really tragic story of a man who had a tremendous potential, a man who could have been one of the greatest powers of God in the history of a nation, a man who had been endowed by God, a man who had the Spirit of God, a man who had tremendous strength, a man who is a nemesis to the enemies of God and should have been in the records as one of the greatest heroes of God's people in delivering the people of God from their enemies. Instead, we see the tragic story of a wasted life, of a wasted potential. This is an old story of the Bible which occurred 3,000 years ago, but I think it's still happening today. When I look around, I see young people who are marvelously talented by God, each endowed by God with special gifts and abilities. And what are they doing with these talents? I see them experimenting with drugs, see them going to parties and drinking alcohol. I see them getting drawn into experimenting with sex, many being overcome by these lusts. I see them destroying their lives, wasting their potentials. And it makes my heart ache knowing what they could have become for God. The tremendous waste is a tragic thing. It's affected a lot of my friends. It's affected my family. I think it's probably touched all of us in one way or another throughout our lives. Now, I grew up as a teenager in the 60s, so I'm not new to the concept of the regular use of drugs, experimentation and free love, trips on LSD, or any of that sort of stuff. I mean, I was part of that generation, and I did as much or more than most of that era. But God had a plan for my life, and he turned a bad situation around to use it for his plan. One night, when I was a young man, I actually dropped what my friends told me was 13 hits of purple double donors. I mean, I was actually on the edge of the upper story roof of the old Elks Club building in Lamar, Colorado. I was balancing on the top of the outer wall, walking around it, looking down, and the thought actually crossed my mind that in my current drugged up state that I might have developed the ability to float above the ground. And as I contemplated attempting to float over the wall and down to the street, I suddenly became extremely sick. No doubt, probably from the large amount of poison in my system. That stuff was cut with strychnine, so there was enough in there to pretty well kill about anybody, especially if I really did 13 hits. I actually started to get nauseous, and I began to vomit over the side of the building. And the magnificent colors coming from that vomit made me drop to my knees and admire my handiwork. I vomited until I came to my senses and realized that I would never have been able to pull off that float. So I'm glad I missed that experiment. But the fact that I got sick, the fact that I began to vomit, probably saved my life and set me up for the rest of my life. So God had his hand in that in spite of my terrible actions that I decided to take by doing the drugs in the first place. You see, the Lord had a plan for me. Well, I'm not trying to compare my life to that of Samson, believe me. But I believe it's important for each of us to fully understand that God has a plan for our lives, each of us individually. The Lord delivered me out of that bondage, and I never became drug dependent. And since those days, I've been able to share this message to those, whom the Lord put in my path. And I'd like to think that some folks have benefited from my experience. Over the years, I've seen good young people get so deep into drugs, alcohol, and porn that they've all but ruined their lives. I've seen others come to a realization of where their life is headed and take a stand to seek the Lord and escape their deadly lifestyle. These young folk getting pulled into dependence on the things of the world could all be compared to the life of Samson. It is so tragic what he could have been. The wasted potential is always tragic. Folks think they don't need God. They're convinced they can get by on their own. They believe they can play with fire and not get burned. They believe they can improve on God's plan for their lives without God in it. They believe they can mess around in the camp of the enemy and come out safely. But it's simply not true. You know, I pray that the Lord help us, that we're not modern day Samsons. I pray that God will help us to make our commitment to Jesus Christ and to keep our commitment to Him until our dying day. You know, I've been through a lot in my life. I've done a little bit of everything, been involved in a little bit of everything. And my youth was something that I'll never forget. I have a lot of stories that I share as I go through life, many times because they were such opposite of what I really should have done. But in spite of all that, God's managed to bless me and guide me and take the bad that I've done and turn it around for good. And to set goals in my life and to put me in a position to where I now can actually speak about the Word and understand what I'm saying. Hopefully those things that I do have to say and those explanations that I lay out there on this kind of thing and those opinions, those thoughts that I have on Scripture are a blessing to others. I have to pray that others are going to hear those things and get something out of it that will help them. That's all part of God's plan. And I am so happy that I'm part of that. I'm going to close this now. That's just my thoughts on chapter 16 of the book of Judges. Chapter 17 I'll have out in a few more days. Until next time, this is Don Stephens. God bless you.